all searched up which there to use when the night gets long and the words get a little fuzzy. And if I'm being honest, there are some elusive grammar rules that are just a little hard to nail down. Fear not, writers, rested and unrested alike, for today I'm going to give you a little perspective on perspective. Hello, my name is Sophia Terrio. I'm a writer, musician, and creative, and today we're going to talk about POV, point of view, perspective, whatever you want to call it. This is one of those writing mechanics that gets explained a lot on a very surface level, but that we rarely delve deeper into. And in this video, I want to cover the whole range of point of view from the very basic to the highly advanced. And while some of this stuff you can do on your first draft, some of it really is a revising issue. So whether you've just started your first draft or you're deep into your seventh, this advice could still come in handy. Point of view goes far beyond just first, second, and third person. And no, I'm not going to tell you about a fifth person or a seventh person, but there are things like psychic distance and omniscience that you may have heard of before, but might not know what they even mean. Or maybe you do know what they mean, but you just need a little refresher. I mean, you're the one who clicked on this video, so you must be here for a reason, right? But now I've done the research and I'm gonna lay it out for you in a way that hopefully makes it very easy to understand. And needless to say, this video is going to be a bit on the long side as we move from beginner to advanced, so feel free to save it for later to reference again during different parts of your writing process, different books, etc. Let's dive in. Point of view can be divided into three easy to remember categories: first person, second person, and third person. You'll hear people use perspective, POV, and point of view to describe the same thing. We're all talking about the same thing, and that is the perspective of the narrator. Sometimes your narrator is your main character or another character in the story, and sometimes your narrator is a fly on the wall watching the events play out but having no bearing on the story itself. All of that is dictated in part by which POV you're using. But when we talk about first, second, or third person, we're specifically talking about what lens your narrator is seeing the story through. The first person POV is when your narrator is a character in the story. They use pronouns like I, me, we, and us to describe the events in the story happening to that character, which are also called first person pronouns, conveniently enough. Second person POV is when the narrator is speaking to the main character using you, your, y'all pronouns, and things of that nature. This one can be a little trickier to identify and is considered the hardest to write in because sometimes when we use the second person, we actually omit the pronoun entirely. This happens in things like recipes or instruction manuals when you say things like, put the batter into the pan, bake at 350. They mean you stir the batter and you bake at 350. Betty Crocker is not gonna come into your house and do it for you. Finally, we have the third person, which uses she, he, they, it, etc. pronouns. These are the third person pronouns. In this case, your narrator is not your perspective character and might not even be a character in the story. This point of view tends to have a lot of flexibility, which we'll talk about much later in the video. Now, you may have noticed he and she are the only explicitly gendered pronouns I've listed thus far in the video. We've talked about first person pronouns, second person pronouns, and third person pronouns that don't have an explicit gender in the English language. They, them, theirs are all pronouns that we use in the plural and can also use in the singular that describe someone without ascribing them a gender. This is the hot button topic of pronoun use, and while I am not going to argue about the existence of non-binary people, they exist, have existed for a long time, and will continue to exist whether you want them to or not. What I want to talk about today are some arguments that I've heard of why the singular they is improper English, or why people still avoid using it in literary works. In English, we do use the pronoun they to describe people in the plural of any gender combination, and there are some folks who learned in school school that using the singular they lacks specificity and therefore is improper, and they were instructed to use he or she, depending on when you learned this. And as you may know, my general opinion is that clear writing is good writing. However, I don't think assigning a gender to someone when you don't know it is clear. Language evolves with culture and evolves over time. For quite a while, people would use the pronoun he to describe anyone of indiscriminate gender, but that fell out of practice as we moved from a non-discriminate him to a more inclusive he or she. But that created a whole new problem. He or she is clunky and long and really annoying. We moved from a 2-letter pronoun to a 3-word pronoun. Luckily, we have a much more elegant solution, and that's the singular they. And as for folks who were scolded against using it in school, well, obviously you knew how to use it enough to be using it, so it should be somewhat intuitive to use it now. You conjugate the singular they in the same way as the plural they, meaning they went, they walk, but with a few careful swaps like using themself instead of themselves. Our language has evolved, and now proper English requires that you use it. It's clear, concise, and it doesn't assume knowledge that the narrator or reader doesn't have access to. If we don't know someone's gender, why are we guessing? We don't have to. And if you're wondering under what context we won't know the gender of someone, it could be for an anonymous donor. There are so many times in which we're unaware of who we're talking about specifically. So if using him ubiquitously is offensive and using he or she is clunky and awkward, this beautiful, wonderful 4-letter pronoun is already here for the taking. So take it. I heard that referring to this person using they, them pronouns, especially if they're in a room with other people, will be confusing, whether you're talking about them in the singular or them in the plural. And it's really not that hard. We've been writing stories with 2 women or 2 men in the same scene for centuries, and no one has a problem distinguishing which she we're talking about. Most often, we just use a character's name or an epithet, and your reader is smarter than you think they are, and they can pick up on what's going down. There's so many ways to avoid that problem, it shouldn't even be talked about, quite frankly. And I would know. I have done it. It was easy. If you're really concerned about confusion and you're still unsure about it, just ask your critique partners or beta readers if they're confused at any point so that you can adjust your language to include a name or an epithet as previously discussed. Okay, now that we're clear on that, let's dive deeper into these 3 points of view and talk about how you can decide which one to use in your novel. If you've already forgotten by now, the first-person pronouns are I, me, we, us, and in this case, the narrator is the perspective character referring to themselves. First person is especially popular in young adult and fantasy novels, but isn't off-limits to any genre. However, it is one of the most polarizing points of view. Some readers absolutely despise first person, and some people absolutely love it. Young adult and fantasy readers might be more used to seeing first person in their books. And ultimately, as the writer, whatever works for your writing style and your book is the one you have to go with. But pay attention to tense in this point of view, meaning present tense or past tense. Though it's very common in the third person to write in the past tense, and in fact this is seen as sort of standard in literature, there isn't a standard tense when using first person. And a book written in the past tense from first person might imply that the perspective character makes it out of the book alive. If that's part of the tension of your novel or the big mystery, you might be accidentally diffusing that tension by subconsciously telling the reader that the character does live to tell the tale. And while writing in the present tense makes no promises to your reader that that character will live even the next page, it can sometimes feel awkward for writers to switch into writing in the present tense. As I mentioned before, writing in the past tense is a standard in the third person. So switching to first person and the present tense might be a bit of a cognitive shift. And again, it kind of just depends on how you want to tell your story. It's also very important that you, the writer, are comfortable in the point of view and tense that you're writing your book in. If you're constantly having to adjust your tense into the present or translate your point of view into the first person, that's a great indicator that you've chosen the wrong point of view and the wrong tense for your writing style. If it feels awkward writing reading it or you have to focus on it, it's probably going to make other parts of your writing suffer. If only because you don't have the bandwidth to remember stronger verbs and take out all the adverbs. I also want to note that if you do choose to write in the first person, especially in the past tense, you don't necessarily have to give your reader the reason that this account came to be. Some authors will frame their novel as a story being told by the main character from the future, such as Patrick Rothfuss's The Name of the Wind. Other times, the reader is meant to believe they're reading a published or rediscovered diary or journal from the main character's perspective, like Rebecca Yaros's Fourth Wing. And that has some mixed reviews. I'm not saying that either book is bad, and in fact, I thoroughly enjoyed reading both, and I'm also not saying their authors were in the wrong. I'm only telling you what I've heard from other fellow readers. You would be surprised how far readers are willing to suspend their disbelief for things like dragons and magic, and how little leeway they'll give you on how is it possible that a person wrote such great detail in their diary every single day of their life. Or, I don't know if I would have published someone's explicit sexual encounters in such a way, just for the sake of perpetuity. It also introduces more questions. How did they get here? Why are they telling the story now? Why did they publish this diary in the future? That all of a sudden you have to answer. Whereas if I told you a story from the first person in the past tense, chances are as a reader you're not even going to question how the story came to be. Or you might idly imagine how the story came to be, but you wouldn't necessarily expect an explanation. Aside from the tense, the first person point of view also invites you to write in a far more casual or conversational tone in the narration. After all, your character is telling the story and is going to tell it in their own voice. And that can be great because it feels like you're being told the tale by a close friend. However, the greatest pro can also become a con if not used correctly. The narration itself needs to strongly reflect the perspective character, meaning you have to understand their voice really, really well in order to write the entire book using it. For example, if your character is a snark machine, I would expect a lot of witty comebacks to also appear in the narration. Everything your reader experiences on the page is filtered through your character, so everything should feel like your character, which is great if that's how you want to tell your story, but can be difficult if you're trying to convey information to your reader that your character either wouldn't know or would never admit. And if you're thinking, oh no, my character's an unreliable narrator, it's exceedingly difficult to signal that to your reader. They're going to take your book at face value until proven otherwise. And it's the proven otherwise part that's exceedingly difficult in the first person. Another downside that I personally have when writing in first person that you might not is that I struggle to insert my character's name. I don't conversationally use people's names very often in my real life, and so it feels awkward to do so in my books. And if I'm writing in the first person, then the reader only hears my main character's name when spoken by other characters or written down on a document. My character is referring to themselves as I, me, we. So unfortunately, my reader might forget it. And now if you're thinking, no, there's no way the reader would forget the character's name, it's happened. Not only in books that I've written, but also books that I've read. Just something to think about. Now let's move on into the second person. The second person uses pronouns like you, your, and y'all to describe the perspective character. And this one's really tricky because in this case, the perspective character is the reader. Now, plenty of writing professors and authors will tell you second person is off limits. We don't write books in the second person. And I will agree to some extent. And I'm going to expand on that thought a little bit. There are circumstances in which the second person is effective. For example, choose your own adventure novels might use the second person to make the reader feel even more immersed in the adventure that they are choosing. It could also be done in a very short story written in instructional format like a recipe. Overall, it is a massive challenge and I don't recommend using it for more than, say, 1,000 words. It's not very marketable novel as a full novel and probably will be exhausting for your reader. Also, it comes with some serious pitfalls that could make it nearly impossible to achieve over a piece that's so long. And the most major one of all is that you can't describe your perspective character, because again, using the second person makes your reader the perspective character. You're speaking to them, telling them what they're doing and what they're thinking and what they look like. And for most readers, they don't want to be told what they're thinking, what they're feeling, or what they look like, because if it doesn't match up, it feels lazy, or at worst, like the book isn't written for them, and you might be throwing out large swaths of audience that otherwise may have picked up your book. Think about it this way. If you used a sentence like, "You're sad that she said that to you," but your reader didn't feel sad, they're being told how to feel, and that's a whole separate video and a whole separate problem that you need to avoid in your writing. It's not a great thing to do. And if your reader doesn't identify deeply with these emotions, they might feel very distanced from the story or even completely disconnected. Likewise, if you use a physical description like, "You're too short to reach the top shelf," all of a sudden every tall reader you have can't relate to the story you're telling. Readers look, act, sound, smell, and live as differently as any other human on the planet, which is to say, completely differently. And now you can imagine why it's so tricky to do well. You can't ascribe any feelings to your perspective character, nor physical description, which leaves description of the setting and the other characters, but in general it might be very difficult to get your reader to identify with a story about themselves that they have no control in. It's a great challenge or writing warm-up, but I would advise against using the second person unless you want to take on a very difficult challenge. Now, obviously, your writing is your own and you're the ultimate arbiter over whatever words come out of your fingertips. And if you're curious about whether your novel deserves to be the rule breaker, you can find a flowchart on my Patreon that explains when it's okay to break the rules of writing. If you're considering writing in the second person, I do recommend checking out that flowchart to see if it's worth it, or if maybe you should just pick a different project for now. And that flowchart is available to download for free from my Patreon, and you don't even have to be a member to access it. Now let's go ahead and move right along into the third person. Third person is the most common point of view across all genres in fiction. It also has the most flexibility when it comes to things like psychic distance and omniscience. Unlike the first person, the third person keeps your character's name freshly in their mind because you use it in the narration as well as in any stray dialogue, and allows you to balance out some of those pesky little pronouns with other things like their name or an epithet. An epithet, by the way, is a phrase that you use to describe someone that's not necessarily a pronoun or their proper noun. For example, I might be the redhead on your computer screen, whatever I am to you. Those are examples of an epithet, which you can use in the third person to break up the pronouns and the names and all of that that comes along with it. If you read a lot in English, you're probably very familiar with third person in the past tense, as I would say that's most frequently used in a literary context. However, you can choose to write in the present tense if you so desire, and ultimately it really just depends on what you're comfortable with and what feels like it fits for your story. In the third person, though, there isn't really an implication that the character lives through the story to tell the tale because, well, the character's not telling the tale, it's someone else entirely. And in the third person, we actually don't even have to identify who the narrator is. They could be a fly on the wall, or they could be some other notable character in the future looking back on these events, but ultimately we don't need to know. Let's move on into maybe the most spicy POV of all, which is multiple POV. This is a sort of secret extra point of view that we love. It's very popular right now in a lot of fiction, especially in fantasy, which is what I read and write, and it's a lot of fun. However, it's not as easy as people sometimes think it is. And this one's super fun because it could be written in third, first, second, or some combination thereof. You only have to be sure that you're consistent. If this character is using first person and that character's using third, keep it that way the whole time. Most commonly, however, we see all of the characters talked about in the third person. And when we get into Omniscience, you're going to have a very limited omniscience. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose. And we'll talk about that too. This is a great way, though, to get that really limited omniscience and still get a lot of information from different characters in your story. People will do this with the main character and the love interest in a romance, or the character and the villain, or sometimes a couple of different characters from your main cast whose stories inexplicably intertwine. However, there are some rules, and these rules are not necessarily ones you can break. Rule number 1, you need a clear visual cue to your reader that you've changed perspectives. Most of the time, people recommend every chapter changing perspectives, and that's what I like to do as well. However, you can change perspectives within a chapter. You just have to use I think it's called a dinkus. You have to use a little visual cue to say, hey reader, look at me, I changed. That's all you need. Number 2, I highly recommend starting each perspective with that character's name in the first sentence. This is feedback I actually got from my Readers Theater, which is a video I'll make in the future, but they're essentially my first round of beta readers. And they would get confused if I started a chapter with a different character's name because, hey, they assumed it was that character's chapter, and that's a fair assumption for a reader to make. Using that character's name goes a long way to signaling to the reader immediately which character's mind we're in. Number 3, take some time to really learn every character's voice and distinguish them from each other. This is maybe one of the more difficult parts of multiple POV. Similarly to first person, you have to know your characters well enough to be able to write from their voice. Also, you have to be able to write from a different character's voice within the context of the same book. I have a character who is morose and just uses big words and lots of angst and emotion. And then I have another character who's very witty and snarky and uses short sentences and sarcasm. And they felt different in their chapters. So if a reader picked up their book mid-chapter, they could easily remember whose perspective they were in. Is there this really long and angsty description of the fog? Well, it's not the Snark Machine character now, is it? This also really helps if you ever want to make an audiobook, because those readers don't get a visual cue on the page if you've changed perspectives. Here is another way it can be very obvious to your reader, hey, we're in a different person's head now, and that's what we want. Rule number 4 is the optional rule. And really, if you did rules 1 through 3, you don't need this one, but it's something that people like to do, and that is put the prospective character's name in the chapter title. This can look like Chapter 1, Sophia, Chapter 2, Little Jim, or you could choose a different thematic chapter title depending on the character. A hair so red, a fur so gray? Do you have fur? He is an elephant. Maybe hair? They are mammals, right? Anyway, multiple POV is not for the faint of heart and isn't really a shortcut when you don't know which perspective to use in your novel. In fact, I would say it's way harder than using a traditional third person or first person perspective where you just use one character's perspective. Every POV character should be basically a co-protagonist in your story. Every single POV character needs to be interesting and needs to be exactly as interesting as your main character, not more interesting. One of the most difficult parts of multi-POV stories is making sure that the reader is engaged and interested in every single character. No one wants to slog through half the book just to read the more interesting chapters. So that means every POV character should have their own character arc and relation to the main plot, and relationships to the other characters. If I have one character who's not the protagonist, but they're a perspective character, their only relationship in the story should not be the protagonist. Otherwise, why are we in their head? It's also vital that you don't write the same scene twice. Sometimes I see this happen when we can't decide which perspective character is more important because they both feel important. And this is really, really tough, but we don't want to see the same sequence of events. It's so much more boring the second time around, and in fact, I kind of skim through it. I already know what's happening. I already know what's about to happen. The tension is gone completely, and all I'm here for is like the flavor of another character experiencing the same thing. I don't really need that. Chances are one character's perspective is more effective than the other, and I know it's really hard, but you need to delete one of those chapters. And if you really can't decide between the two of them, you can swap back and forth throughout the scene using those visual breaks when it's most important to be in this character's eyes or that character's eyes within the same chapter. I've also seen people recently talking about, if I have these two characters in the same scene, how do I know which one to write from? And that can be really difficult. And here's a few pieces of advice for that very specific issue. If you're writing a scene that has two or more of your perspective characters in it, then you can choose which character maybe has a more interesting perspective of the scene. Which character is hitting an emotional beat or a major character development point in this scene? Which character is maybe more or less cognizant of the actions happening around them? And which tone or narrative voice best fits this scene? If I'm writing an action sequence, my morose and wordy character might have a harder time with the quippy, fast-paced action that needs to happen. So I might choose to use my other snarky character who would be much more suited to that kind of scene. A friend of mine writes his books like this very effectively. It's really engaging as a reader to see all of these events through these characters, and also it kind of keeps the pace moving and just perfectly chaotic. But again, it's really hard to do well, and it's not at all a shortcut. Last but certainly not least, your perspective characters need to know each other, or at least their stories need to overlap in some way. And it should be obvious fairly early on in the book how they're related. Basically, your reader needs a strong reason as to why you didn't write separate books. Even if they're in the same universe or they interact in some, they could be different books. Why aren't they different books? And in the case of books like How to Be Both by Ali Smith or Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, the characters exist across different times and never interact with each other. However, there is a thematic and physical connection between them, which is also connected to like the theme of the book and the message overall that they're trying to tell the reader. In How to Be Both by Ali Smith, both characters interact with the same art piece. In Cloud Cuckoo Land, every single character interacts with the same story that's been preserved throughout history, and you recognize right away that they're connected. So now that you fully understand multiple POV, I hope, let's dive into some even more complex topics, which are omniscience and psychic distance. Now, these are topics that really only apply to writing in the third person. By that, I mean, while there is still a level of omniscience and psychic distance in the first person and second person, they really don't matter as much because there's not a lot of leeway there. But in the third person, we have the full range of possibilities, which also means the full range of possible errors. Mistakes abound. Omniscience and psychic distance are difficult concepts even for experienced writers, and I even had to do a little research to make sure I was getting this all correct. So hopefully we can demystify the whole thing and set us all on the right path. Omniscience describes the narrator's relation to the story. Psychic distance describes the reader's relation to the story. Now, these are different, but they are also very connected. And both of them have a huge impact on the reader's experience of the story. Also, both come with some pitfalls that, while technically not wrong, will come across as a mistake. Let's get into it. Omniscience means having complete knowledge or awareness. It comes from omni, meaning all, and scient, meaning knowing, like science. And it's really not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Omniscience in the writing world means how much information your narrator has access to. And I'm going to give you a hint right now, it's never all of the information. Omniscience can be very limited or close to the character's perspective, or very far and able to see more of the story. We can think of this as like a camera in relation to your character. If the camera was really, really far away with like a bird's eye view over the scene, you could see your character and you could see the bad guy just around the corner waiting to sneak up on them and take them by surprise. But you might not necessarily see your character's thoughts or inside feelings. We're too far away. And if we zoom in a little closer, maybe we can see the character and their immediate surroundings. A little here, a little there, but not far enough away to know that the bad guy is hiding around the corner. If we zoom in even closer, then we can see the character's thoughts and feelings, but we really can only see what they're seeing. And hey, it's like we're in the first person. And we basically are, but we're using third-person pronouns. This is the closest omniscience you can have, and really the only time that you have direct access to every thought your character has. So when we have problems with omniscience, in really limited omniscience, it's usually because we're giving the reader access to information that character doesn't know. Here's where we get into our first pitfall where you might make a mistake that's technically not a mistake. And that is, don't let your character assume anything. This is really tough. We all make assumptions just in the course of our lives all the time. But if you let your character assume something in your story that turns out to be true, it looks a little contrived. You had inside knowledge as the writer, and you gave that knowledge to the character, or so it may seem. And so it looks as though you created an error in omniscience. Your narrator, your character, shouldn't have known that information, and yet they got access to it magically without trying. So even if your character is assuming something correctly, and even though that's not technically an error, it does read that way because it's fiction and you wrote it. And this is one of those instances wherein writing something with complete accuracy to real life is wrong. What are you gonna do? And your character could see things like that the other character is conflicted or sad, but not necessarily know what that character is conflicted or sad about. And they should only work with what they got and what they've put together in their brain. As the author, you have access to all of the information, and you have to keep some of that information from your narrator, from your reader. And the hardest part is deciding what information needs to be said and what information needs to be secret. So now let's zoom our omniscience back out slightly. We're outside of their head, so we can't really see their thoughts anymore. And this is where we get another common omniscience error. If you have anything but the most limited omniscience, we should not have access to any inner thoughts that characters are having. And sometimes we see this where thoughts are written in italics or sort of separated to look like dialogue, but even this I just avoid entirely. We can't get any information from what a person might perceive of our character without having access to their exact thought process. We can see the character is tearing up, their lip is trembling, they're about to cry. We can see all of the events that happen to our character and the actions they take, and we can learn a lot about them through that. If you've never heard of dramatic irony, it's my personal favorite form of irony, and that is when the reader or the audience knows something that the character doesn't. This happens very frequently when we know two characters have information the other character needs. The other character doesn't know that yet. Like the character's walking down the street and the villain is hiding around the corner ready to take them by surprise. The reader knowing that the villain is there around the corner waiting to take them by surprise creates a lot of tension in the story. It brings the reader to the edge of their seat waiting to see what's going to happen when the villain jumps out and surprises the character. Now the character doesn't know that the villain is there, but the reader does. And that's the entire source of the tension. That's the whole thing. You can't have dramatic irony when you're in that super close omniscience, because there's never going to be an instance where the reader knows something the character doesn't. So the beautiful thing about this zoomed out, more omniscient narrator is that we do get things like dramatic irony and situations where we get to see what the villain is plotting while the main character is still figuring out how to thwart them, or what might come next, or how can we cut them off at the pass. So if you don't think multiple POV is right for your story, but you do still want the perspectives of more than one character, this might be a great way to do it. However, again, you do have to be careful that you're not giving your narrator more information than they're allowed to have. So now we're going to talk about another pitfall of omniscience, and this one is a mistake. It's not just a pretend mistake that looks like a mistake, it is. And that's called head hopping. Head hopping is often confused with multiple POV, or just a natural consequence of greater omniscience, and that's not the case. Head hopping happens because we're changing the omniscience from being too close to too far away. And this, my friends, doesn't get to happen. In the course of your story, you should have the same level of omniscience the whole time. And I say that because it can be really jarring to your reader. It's not necessarily going from the mind of this person to the mind of this person. It's more so that we went from a far omniscience to a close one and then back to a far one. This also happens when you have a multiple POV situation where you're just not distinguishing when you change POVs. So in that instance, it's head hopping because you're hopping from this person's brain to this person's to this person's. And that's also why we have those multiple POV rules where you have clear delineation between your characters, obvious visual changes when you're switching POVs, etc. And I would say this is also an omniscience shift. We're getting access to characters we shouldn't have access to, thoughts we shouldn't have access to, and it's kind of a mess and it's really confusing. So if you're doing multiple POV, you have to be in a limited omniscience. If you're doing first person, you have to be in a limited omniscience. If you're doing third person and you have a greater omniscience, you cannot give your reader access to people's thoughts and internal minds. And that's kind of it. That's the whole deal. So even though omniscience means all-knowing, really your narrator never gets to be all-knowing. You, the writer, get to be, but that's it. If you're trying to write from a farther omniscience, but you're really struggling to get emotionality from your characters, try focusing on physical displays of emotion rather than internal thoughts. By this, I mean their lip quivers and tears well in their eyes, or their fists clench. All of that nonverbal communication is juicy. That's what we want. And also, that's all we get. So I would focus on that. And if you need more knowledge, try watching a movie or going to a play and really focus on the actors and how they portray emotion. They're not sitting there going, "Oh, I'm so mad." No, they're going, "Oh." And that's great. That's what you want. Describe that. By the way, this is not important to this video, but I just want to say intrinsically, there's a huge connection between acting and writing. I think a lot of writers can learn from a lot of actors, and obviously actors portray the things that writers write. It's a circle. It's not a one-way street. We get to see how people portray and show and feel in a way that helps us improve our writing. And with improved writing, actors get to portray and show and feel even better. That's a little comment for you playwrights and screenwriters out there. I would say that sticking to one level of omniscience, especially writing in the third person, is a really strong indicator of whether or not you have experience writing. Now, because it's such a complicated topic, I would suggest doing an entire revision pass looking just at point of view. And I know what you might be thinking, wait, hold on, an entire revision pass? There's more than one? Yes. And soon I hope to go through the revision process for me, all of the steps I take, and give you a big long list of things to look out for in your novel to make it truly sparkle. You can subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to know when I post that video. Now that we've explored the omniscience of it all, let's get into the psychic distance. I think this is maybe even less talked about than Omniscience. Psychic distance, as I mentioned before, is the relationship the reader has to the story. And it's very connected to Omniscience, but they're not the same. Let's talk about it. Unlike Omniscience, psychic distance can change throughout your novel, but we want to do those changes slowly and gradually, and really not a lot. Maybe once, maybe twice, but you're pushing it. There are 5 levels of psychic distance, with 1 being the farthest you can be, and 5 being the closest. Level 1 is a very bird's eye view description. We don't get very much detail. We don't know any characters. It's the lay of the land. This might be like the first sentence of your novel describing the town that things will happen in. If we see your character, all we get is a woman riding a bicycle or a person walking their dog down the street. We don't know their name. We know hardly anything about them. And we know that there is a street. Level 2 gets a little bit closer, maybe giving us a few personal details like the character's name. Now all of a sudden we have Sophie riding her bicycle and little Jim walking their dog down the street. A level 3 psychic distance feels a lot closer, getting more of those personal descriptions, but not really the full motivations of the characters. Little Jim walks their dog down the street with a heavy step and a frustrated glare in their eye. At level 4, we do get the motivations behind the character. We could learn that Sophia is on her way to visit her best friend. And at level 5, closest psychic distance. This is when we get all the juicy details. We get the motivation, the detail, the deeper emotional and mental understanding of a character. Now, level 1 psychic distance is rarely ever applicable, and you'd really only use it in a few niche circumstances and the beginning of your novel. I haven't done a video yet on how to begin your novel, but this is usually not the best way. Pretty much levels 1 through 3, I would expect not to use. It creates enough distance from your reader to the story that they might not care about the events happening or why they ought to be here reading this book anyways. So I would say typically we want to sit around a 4 or a 5. Like I said, we can transition between the levels in a story, but almost always you want to be transitioning closer down the levels toward that level 5. You wouldn't forget the character's name, for example. Again, there are some niche circumstances where at the end of your book you might zoom out into the world at large, or right after the climax, zoom out to look at the aftermath of the battle. But all of that can only happen if you have a pretty large omniscience, or if your character's in a helicopter. Either way, when we do these moves and shifts throughout the story, we want to do them slowly, gradually, and intentionally. It's very important that within the span of one sentence, we don't jump from level 1 to level 4. I don't make the rules, I just tell them to you. There are a whole slew of other writing mistakes that boil down to creating psychic distance where psychic distance ought not to be. For example, if you've ever heard to delete the filter words out of your story, like saw, felt, and wondered, that's just creating distance between the reader and the story. Instead of being inside the character's head, they're being told explicitly, you're being filtered through the character's head, and you're on that side of the filter and we're on this side of the filter. And we don't want that. There's no divider. What the character is seeing, the reader is seeing. What the character's feeling, the reader's feeling through them. Things like this, writing advice that's fairly common, ultimately is there because it creates extra psychic distance that we don't need or want. And if we're going to look even further into these issues, a lot of it might stem from the fact that you don't know your character that well. Just as with first person and that super limited omniscient third, you have to know your character well enough to speak through them in their own voice. It's probably helpful to know that voice no matter what omniscience or point of view you're using, because knowing your character deeply also means knowing your story deeply. And if you know your story deeply, you can help your reader see it from that really close psychic distance that engages them and keeps them up all night, just constantly turning pages because they can't put it down. They feel the feelings and they're seeing the scenes. That's what we want for our readers, and that's what we want for ourselves. So if you're ever sitting at your book thinking, I just don't know what my character would do, that's okay. And maybe you can do a couple of writing exercises to figure it out. And then maybe on your revision process, you want to make a note to yourself that you're going to go back and check in on your psychic distance, check in on your omniscience, and check in on how well you know your character, how well your character has developed. Yeah, sometimes we lose track, especially when characters have grown and changed a lot over the story. That just means you want to check up on it and make sure that you're on the right track. Yet again, with psychic distance, there's probably moments in what I've described where you've thought, well, hey, I could write a story that breaks this rule, or I bet I could zoom out and make it effective. Go ahead. But you might want to head over to my Patreon and download that flowchart to make sure you're breaking the rules in a good way. I have thoroughly enjoyed making this deep dive on point of view, and I got to do some research along the way that helped me in my own writing process, and I hope you enjoyed it just as well. I'm curious to know if there's a POV that you particularly love or hate to read or to write. I really like writing in limited third in present tense, but I know that bugs a lot of people. If you're interested in more videos about writing, the arts, and the controversies surrounding them, subscribe to my channel, because that's what I make. And yet again, that free download is on my Patreon. You don't have to be a member to access any of my downloads, but if you want to be a member, you also get access to my exclusive Discord server, where we will have live events and writing sprint races and all sorts of fun things over there. And the link for that, by the way, is in my description. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy creating.